And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Imagine that one of the most powerful corporations in the world, a giant of the digital economy, decides to leave its homeland, the United States. All of America freezes. It's not just a departure, but a real escape that shakes not only the financial markets, but the entire political system of the country. It was the moment when the world realized that global corporations no longer depend on flags and borders. What happened? How did one economic mistake destroy an entire empire?
Tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
In 2025, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that was supposed to be the flagship of a new economic policy, raising tariffs on foreign goods. But no one expected that this decision would be followed by a blow that would strike America at the very heart of its economy. Tariffs, designed to revive the domestic market and bring manufacturing back home, became the catalyst for the largest corporate exodus in U.S. history.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
The first company that not only refused to comply with the new rules, but literally broke the system was Amazon. Known for its commitment to innovation and leadership, the corporation began secretly preparing for a large-scale operation that would soon be dubbed Silver Compass. At first, it looked like a minor update to the website, where the company began to indicate how government duties were increasing the price of goods. But behind this was a signal that only those in the know understood. Amazon was preparing for a global restructuring. And when it became known in April 2025 that the company was planning to move its headquarters outside the US, the whole world froze.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
Instead of compromising with the authorities, Amazon began looking for new countries for its operational base. Singapore, Ireland, Canada, and the United Arab Emirates became the center of the new corporate world, where Amazon found political neutrality, favorable tax conditions, and access to international markets. But what is behind this move? Why did the world's largest corporation decide to leave a country that once helped it grow and become a giant?
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
The conflict between the US government and Amazon escalated into a full-scale economic war when the White House accused the company of undermining national interests. Senators are demanding an investigation, and unions are calling it treason. At the moment when the government decides to investigate Amazon's offshore assets, it becomes clear that no one can stop this exodus. But here's what's important. Amazon's departure is not just a corporate scandal.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
It is a landmark event that will shake the entire digital economy and change global supply chains. Within months, other major corporations such as Apple, Tesla, and Walmart follow Amazon's lead. None of them want to be dependent on Washington's decisions anymore. So how did one economic decision destroy a system that had long been considered unshakable? Who is to blame for this catastrophic split between business and government? And can what has been lost now be recovered? We delve into this story to understand how an empire that was once the center of the digital economy collapsed. It all started quietly. In early December 2024, at a time when the US economy was already beginning to recover from the pandemic and seemed stable, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that was to become a new milestone in the country's economic policy. He announced the introduction of tariffs on a wide range of goods from Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Products from China, Germany, South Korea, and Brazil were now subject to additional duties of up to 35%. On paper, it looked like protection of the domestic market, the return of jobs, and economic patriotism. But in reality, the consequences were much deeper and more destructive.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
From the outset, Trump's decision was seen as a step aimed at strengthening the U.S. economy, but within a few months it became clear that it would jeopardize decades of global economic ties. Reduced supplies and higher prices for goods due to tariffs were expected to increase costs for both producers and consumers. Among the first to feel the impact was Amazon, the largest digital corporation. The company's business model, built on instant delivery and global supply chains, was under threat.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Despite its apparent security, Amazon quickly realized that its advantageous position in the market could be undermined. In January 2025, a few weeks after the tariffs were introduced, the first changes appeared on Amazon's website. A new note appeared on product pages. The price includes a duty in accordance with the decree of January 1st, 2025. This was an unexpected move. For the first time, the company openly stated that the price of its products had been artificially inflated due to external economic decisions. The note immediately attracted the attention of buyers, but for the company itself, it was a sign of impending disaster.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10% is really, first of all, 10%, when you collect it, is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
Amazon's shares began to fall, and immediately after the introduction of the new tariffs, the company faced a sharp decline in sales of goods that depended on imports. The electronics and textiles segments, which were actively purchased in low-cost countries such as China and South Korea, were particularly hard hit. In the first 2 weeks after the tariffs came into force, the number of cancelled orders for imported goods increased by 23%. This was only the beginning. The logistics that Amazon had built up over decades began to collapse. And despite the company's attempts to hide the scale of the problem, its consequences became obvious to everyone. A real crisis began within the corporation. Power outages began in Seattle, elevators stopped working, and meetings with management were cancelled amid growing tension.
with Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
What was happening inside the corporation at that moment was difficult to explain. Some employees claimed that top managers were disappearing, and those who remained were acting as if in a panic. Strategic sessions, which had previously been an integral part of corporate life, were now being cancelled without explanation. Anonymous surveys of Amazon employees began to reveal growing concerns, but no one knew what management was hiding. In the first months of 2025, the company's internal problems coincided with a global stock market crash on Wall Street. Amazon's shares lost about 7% of their value, and several large investment funds began to withdraw capital from the company's long-term assets. The situation within the company itself became increasingly tense. Changes in the management structure began within Amazon, and it soon became known that the corporation had decided to carry out a large-scale reorganization of its business processes. This was not just a matter of adjusting contracts with suppliers, but of preparing global steps that could change the business landscape for the entire country. Behind the scenes, active preparations began for a corporate exodus, a step that no one could have even imagined a few months earlier. It soon became known that the company had begun to review agreements with suppliers, actively redirecting them to other countries that were not subject to the new tariffs. It was at this time that strange things began to happen with the company's symbols and corporate culture. At the headquarters in Seattle, employees noticed that banners with the US flag were gradually disappearing. Internal corporate documents, previously filled with patriotism, now stated that Amazon no longer associated itself with US jurisdiction. Preparations for the transfer of key operations abroad were in the final stages. In January 2025, a month before the first official steps toward relocation were taken, discussions began on possible countries for the creation of new business centers. These countries, Singapore, Ireland, Canada, and the United Arab Emirates, were chosen based on their attractiveness in terms of tax conditions, political neutrality, and the availability of a developed digital infrastructure. Amazon has already begun closed-door negotiations with the governments of these countries, offering them tax guarantees and exemptions that would allow the company to operate without pressure from US legislation. Of course, such a strategy could not fail to provoke a reaction from the US authorities. The White House began to suspect that Amazon could be the first of many corporate giants to decide not to comply with tough new rules aimed at economic patriotism. At first, these were just rumors. Then, at a briefing, White House Press Secretary Juliana Kress hinted at dissatisfaction on the part of some large corporations. The same press secretary also said that the administration would actively monitor the situation and was preparing to adjust its relationship with business. Although Amazon was not officially named in the statement, it was obvious that the corporation was the focus of attention. This crisis was the first step toward the complete destruction of the traditional economic principles on which the success of the United States was built. Instead of submitting to the new conditions, Amazon chose a countermeasure that would soon turn into the largest corporate exodus from the US. The company's decision not only affected its future, but also sent a signal to other corporations, which began to consider how to avoid political pressure from the state while ensuring their global competitiveness. When Amazon finally realized that its business model and Trump's policies had become completely incompatible, it took a decisive step that shook the entire US economy. In March 2025, the company announced the launch of a project codenamed Silver Compass. At first, it sounded like just an internal corporate document, but as soon as its contents became known, it became clear that this was not just a plan. It was a plan for a large-scale relocation of the company's headquarters. Although no official announcement was made, documents that began to leak to the media indicated that Amazon was preparing to move its headquarters outside the US. It soon became known that Amazon was considering 4 countries as options for its new base: Singapore, Ireland, Canada, and the United Arab Emirates. These countries were selected based on several key factors: favorable tax conditions, a stable political situation, and highly developed digital infrastructure. Internal high-level meetings began with negotiations with the governments of these countries. Everything went quickly and efficiently. In the first months of 2025, Amazon received preliminary guarantees of tax breaks from the governments of Singapore and Canada, which could last up to 12 years. In addition, these countries offered conditions that would allow the corporation to operate in completely new conditions without interference from local authorities in business processes, which was becoming a crucial factor amid growing political tensions in the US. All this allowed the company to develop a strategy of diversification and independence from US jurisdiction. Amazon did not waste any time in preparing. In April, it had already signed preliminary agreements with the governments of these countries. Initially, the discussions focused not on pause breaks, but also on larger issues, such as the creation of special economic zones that would allow Amazon to operate outside traditional controls. It was these agreements that formed the basis for the next steps. In the end, according to the documents signed in April, the company promised to invest in these countries, create several thousand jobs in each of them, and actively develop research centers. These documents of intent, according to sources, were the real beginning of the end for Amazon's presence in the US. A parallel reorganization was taking place within the company. New departments were created to adapt the business to the new international conditions. One such step was the creation of a new international adaptation department, headed by Carlos Chang, a former top manager of Ours Asia. His task was to ensure the smooth operation of logistics hubs in new countries and to transfer the company's key IT resources to these jurisdictions. By the end of April 2025, it became known that Amazon had leased several large buildings in Dublin to create new IT infrastructure. But at the same time, strange events began to take place at the company's headquarters in Seattle. With each passing day, it became increasingly clear that Amazon's management was actively preparing the business for a catastrophic step. Top managers were nowhere to be seen in the buildings, and all important decisions were now being made behind closed doors, which raised more and more questions. Instead of hiding its preparations for relocation, the company began to take demonstrative steps that signaled that it no longer saw itself as part of the US. In Seattle and other US cities, all American symbols began to disappear from Amazon offices. Previously important events, such as holidays and gatherings dedicated to national dates, were cancelled or replaced with neutral corporate meetings. US flags disappeared from offices and were replaced with Amazon corporate logos. It seemed like a very subtle but at the same time clear statement that the company might no longer wish to be part of US jurisdiction. At that time, the White House was in a panic. Negotiations within the administration became more tense. The government was concerned that the decisions of such large companies could destroy the foundation of the country's entire economic model. In March 2025, the White House officially announced that it would begin an audit of all offshore assets of Amazon and its subsidiaries. This threat only intensified the corporation's actions, and instead of bowing to pressure, it stepped up its preparations for relocation. By early May, when the public began to learn about Amazon's preparations to leave, it was clear that the company was ready to move forward. The entire political landscape of the United States now depended on how events unfolded with Amazon. At the same time, the first real steps began to be taken, which looked like preparations for a global operating network independent of America. By mid-May 2025, it became known that Amazon had begun to review its contractual obligations with suppliers and redirect shipments through new hubs in Singapore and Canada. It became clear to many that Amazon was not just looking for tax breaks, but was preparing to create its own independent system for managing supply, logistics, and even financial operations, completely excluding the US from the chain. When Amazon officially confirmed the relocation of its headquarters to Singapore in May 2025, the US market was shaken. The company's shares plummeted, and panic broke out on the stock markets. At first, shares lost 9.4%, followed by a sharp decline in other technology companies, which came under pressure from the US authorities to review their actions in the context of new political pressure. As a result, Amazon not only left the US but also significantly weakened its economic influence by redirecting its business to countries that offered it more freedom and guarantees. In the first few days after the relocation announcement, the US government reacted immediately. The White House demanded an explanation from Amazon. claiming that the company was undermining national interests, and proposed an investigation into all of the corporation's offshore assets. Senators and political leaders began drafting bills that would impose restrictions on similar moves by other companies, prohibiting them from leaving the country without consequences. However, as practice showed, these measures came too late. The markets had long since reacted to Amazon's departure, and the process was already irreversible. Amazon's quest for international independence showed that corporations were no longer dependent on the political will of a single state. At a time when America was in the throes of a panic-stricken crisis, other countries wasted no time. Canada, Singapore, the UAE, and Ireland, which had already offered Amazon tax breaks and favorable conditions for the creation of new digital hubs, quickly began signing agreements with other corporations. For example, Singapore provided Amazon not only with a 12-year tax holiday, but also with a unique legal infrastructure where disputes were resolved through blockchain arbitration, a method that the US does not even recognize under its own legislation. Ireland and Canada offered the company their support in the form of special economic zones that would allow it not only to minimize its tax burden, but also to develop its digital technologies in new conditions.